Back in 2019, Daniela Garcia Philipson was in New York City. She was working as an intern for the Mexican mission to the United Nations. And one September day, she was headed to the General Assembly with a little extra bounce in her step.
And I was wearing the little blue badge. And I remember I was wearing sneakers because I knew I was going to walk a lot that day, running around the UN.
Danny was excited because she was on her way to a really special event, the next big United Nations forum to talk about gender equality. And her home country, Mexico, was set to announce that they would be one of the hosts.
So it was a huge deal.
As a woman who grew up in Mexico, Danny knew as well as anyone that gender equality and Mexico, they weren't often words that you would hear together.
The Mexican Foreign Affairs Minister was in the room. I couldn't believe I was in the same room with this high-level politician at that time. And I was very keen to hear his speech.
And then the foreign minister stood up to give that speech. And Danny could hardly believe her ears.
He says, Mexico is feminist. I am feminist. Our feminist foreign policy is feminist. And that was the first time I heard a politician say, a Mexican politician embrace the term and say it in a room full of women and feminist activists at the UN.
It was a huge moment.
At first, I was very excited. I was like, this is thrilling that I get to hear this.
But a bit later on that evening,
once the event wrapped up and I was on the subway back home, I was like, but wait, how are they going to do this? Because the implications of Mexico being feminist means that there's a lot of work to do.
Today on Things That Go Boom, we travel to Mexico City to learn just how much work Danny means. Because the women we met there made it clear. Being a woman in Mexico can be brutally difficult.
In Mexico, it's a really violent place. 10 to 11 women are killed every day just because they are women.
There's a lot of corruption, and they don't want the real number of feminicides to become known.
It's a system that makes you feel crazy. The whole system protecting themselves. It's terrible because it's like a horror movie, It's like you're surrounded.
And yet, Mexico has been celebrated for being the first country in the global south to roll out a feminist foreign policy. And it's not just any feminist foreign policy. It's one that's been lauded in the international community, ranking third in the world after Sweden and Norway. So what does it mean for a country to declare such a progressive policy about women's interests abroad while maintaining this disturbing record on the safety and security of its own women at home? To answer that question, my producer Amy and I hopped on a plane to Mexico City to see for ourselves. I'm Lacey Healy, and this is Things That Go Boom.
Sometimes things in the world of technology are complicated and need careful explaining. Sometimes they just need a little hard truth.
I don't think anyone is going to buy a banana with crypto at any point in the foreseeable future.
I'm Lizzie O'Leary, the host of Slate's What Next TBD, your clear-eyed guide to technology, power, and the future. Friday and Sunday, wherever you get your podcasts.
Danny's work as a feminist researcher means she thinks a lot about feminism, peace, and security, particularly when it comes to Mexico. Right now, she's working on her doctorate at Monash University in Melbourne, but she also worked in the Mexican Senate on police reform. And she co-founded an organization called Internacional Feminista, all about foreign policy, international security, and feminism. So naturally, after Mexico announced the adoption of a feminist foreign policy, she started digging in. She wanted to know exactly what it was and if it was really doing what it set out to do.
So yeah, Mexico's feminist foreign policy is based around 5 pillars.
The first one is a feminist foreign policy with a gender perspective and a feminist agenda abroad.
And basically what this means is mainstreaming a gender perspective across all issues in foreign policy.
The second,
parity within the foreign ministry.
That means as many women as men holding positions there. The third pillar, a foreign ministry free of violence that is safe for all.
And that one means that there is zero tolerance for any gender-based violence within the ministry. So the ministry was saying, we'll take seriously any allegations of harassment, sexual assault, etc.
The fourth pillar, quote, equality is visible.
Never really understood what that one means.
And the fifth and final, feminism in all areas of the foreign ministry.
I think the fifth one is supposed to be intersectionality. It's supposed to be the foreign ministry's intersectional in its approach to feminist foreign policy.
Meaning that they need to consider the unique needs of different communities in the Mexican sphere. So indigenous, LGBTQ, migrants, which feels really broad and inclusive, which is great, except I couldn't help but be struck by the fact that all of these pillars, they seem to be limited to the ministry itself.
They are. They are limited to the foreign ministry, and I've joked in the past that it sounds more like an HR policy than it does a foreign policy.
The policy itself was rolled out under the leadership of former Foreign Minister Martha Delgado.
Hola. Hello. Hi. Nice to meet you. I'm Lacey. Nice to meet you too. Hola. Hi. My name is Marta Delgado. I am former Vice Minister of Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Mexico.
Martha's office in Mexico City has a beautiful bright pink bike parked just inside the front door. She's an avid cyclist herself, but she was also responsible for bringing Mexico City its bike share program.
And it was the first in the whole continent, in the Americas.
Martha has a lot of hobbies. She grows her own vegetables, and she's a recorded singer with a few CDs even to her name. She resigned from her role at the ministry to pursue some of these interests, but also to work on her colleague Marcelo Ebrard's political campaign. And today she speaks passionately about the work that she did with ministry colleague Christopher Bolinas to bring Mexico its feminist foreign policy, which she defines as
the willingness of a country to put women in the center of its foreign policy, which is very complex.
At the time that this policy was introduced in 2020, Martha tells us that it was kind of a new era of leadership in the country. That suddenly the people holding important government positions, like lawmakers or governors, they were women.
Like a wave, of women leaders in Mexico.
An amendment to Mexico's constitution the year before had required gender parity in all elected positions. She also says that the administration under Marcelo Ebrard was a progressive one.
He, for example, was the first in the whole Latin American continent as a mayor of Mexico City who made legal abortion in Mexico City before any other government.
All of this led to an atmosphere where a policy with women at its center could be created.
So Mexico has been transformed into a country that is defending a feminist foreign policy where women have a voice and are treated as people that deserve this treatment as equals in all senses.
And she's proud of the work that her policy has helped move forward. Like, for example, when the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan.
Women in Afghanistan asked a lot of countries for help. A lot. Of course, all the developed countries were asked, please help us, please help us. Why Mexico was the first one that opened their arms for women in Afghanistan? Mexico, why? Because of the feminist foreign policy.
But she also acknowledges that the policy isn't perfect, just like the country itself.
Human rights, Mexico is always accused. No, the human rights here are very bad. Yes, it's true. But if someone asks for help, we are here too. It is not contradictory. Contradictory is ask other countries to do what you are not willing to do. That is contradictory.
Martha told us this story from 2020 during the pandemic. It was the heart of lockdown when most people were confined to their homes. But Martha and her colleagues, they were busy in the ministry, figuring out how to get out vaccines.
And suddenly, I read in the newspaper an op-ed of all the European ambassadors, the whole European ambassadors, saying Mexico must stop gender violence in houses, domestic violence, because the pandemic happens to increase the domestic violence in Mexico. So then I asked my team, please, each country that is in this op-ed, go for the websites of the newspapers, what is happening there, okay? In the whole countries in Europe was happening the same. It's not Mexico.
But Dani says that some of the country's response to its problems is at odds with its insistence that it wants to put the well-being of women and girls at the forefront. According to Human Rights Watch, Mexico's military has been known to torture, execute, and arbitrarily detain civilians. And it even refused an order from the country's president to turn over documents related to the 2014 disappearance of 43 college students. And the military's role in Mexico is only growing. Between 2006 and 2021, it took over 246 civil functions, health, education, and social programming included.
Militarization is something that often gets addressed as part of feminist foreign policy. And here there is a huge contradiction in that Mexico has a feminist foreign policy, but at the same time it's militarizing within its borders, and there has to be some type of coherence there.
It's very difficult to be fully consistent in all senses. Internal policy, foreign policy, in the cabinet, in the legislative power, in the justice system. We all have challenges. And this calling a policy feminist and acknowledging our country and our goals as feminists in the first step towards the well-being of women and girls in front of the center was our defense to that kind of criticism.
Dani says that she's still not particularly thrilled that the government made no effort to engage civil society when it created its feminist foreign policy. Perhaps then it could have been stronger. But she also says that civil society isn't holding the government accountable to the terms that it did create.
They don't care. They don't see how it's relevant. And also, fair enough, because 10 women are being murdered every day in Mexico. And there's a forensic crisis because you find mass graves in Mexico every single day. And there is literally not enough forensic capabilities and expertise to try to identify all of the bodies that are found in mass graves. And that is what human rights defenders and feminist activists are working on right now. And if you put it in that perspective, of course people are not going to be working on feminist foreign policy. There are immediate issues that need to be addressed right now that are dire and just awful.
Femicide is an ever-present reality in Mexico. That's the murder of women, including transgender women, because of their gender. In 2012, Mexico became the first country in Latin America to make femicide an official legal term in its criminal code. But rates only continue to rise, with over 1,000 femicides recorded in 2022. And now, Mexico's leading presidential candidates are calling themselves feminists. But do the country's established feminists believe them? That's after the break. On the way to our next stop, the radio was full of reminders that it's an election year in Mexico. Female candidates are actually leading the polls, and it looks like Mexico is well on its way to its first female president. We arrived at UNAM, the prestigious National Autonomous University of Mexico, early in the morning. At what feels like the edge of the city, the campus is covered in rough black rocks that are an immediate reminder that many of the mountains that we see in the distance are actually volcanoes. It's a beautiful contrast to the graffiti and the art that's scrawled on the walls of UNAM's political science building, complete with images of Cesar Chavez and Karl Marx. We were there to meet with Andrea Samaniego Sánchez, a political scientist and feminist expert at the Faculty of Political and Social Science. But we were warned that we might have some trouble finding our way around.
All right, we're here to the maze now. Let's see if we can find our way around the maze.
And we immediately got lost.
This is 4. Is it B? Is there a letter?
No.
Oh, 5, 6, 7. Speaking of mazes.
But eventually, with a little help from a kind stranger and a call from Andrea, we managed to track her down.
We found you.
Yes. Hello.
She was wearing a bright green sleeveless top and making a stop at the coffee cart outside.
I'm just picking up my coffee, and that is E-building, where it's my office.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Professor Samaniego told us that she first became interested in feminism after this realization that she had soon after she started her original focus of study, which was on politics, nation states, and military forces.
I was like astonished, like, why is it that in these classes, in these courses, there are so many men and only me?
What does it feel like to be a woman in Mexico?
Well, I don't want to say that we are always in fear, because it's not, but we are always in alert. In alert because when you are walking down the street, if you are wearing a dress, can flip your dress so that they see your underwear, or they scream at you like anything. Or even in some places in Mexico, if you are good looking or whatever, and some man looks at you and says, you're good, you can be victim of a feminicide just because you were walking through the street.
Danny told us that she's had this same experience.
When I lived in Mexico, I would have a WhatsApp group with a group of women that I didn't even know at that time. And we would just monitor each other when we would go out at night. So like one person was in charge of monitoring each other. And when you got home, you would just send a purple heart to the chat. And so they knew you had arrived home safely.
Andrea says that when you're a woman in Mexico, every time you step out on the streets, you need to think carefully. Am I wearing an outfit that won't attract too much attention? Am I taking a safe enough route? And if the worst happens and you need to get help, say your teenage daughter doesn't come back home one night,
the authority is not going to help you. It's going to say, no, don't you worry. The girl is missing, but maybe she ran away with a boyfriend. No, don't you worry.
With so much to fight for, the feminist movement in Mexico is present and vocal.
This fourth wave of feminism, it's really a global movement. It started in Spain, and then it went to Argentina, and it throughout Latin America has become a really strong movement.
But she says that there's a common disconnect between those working inside the feminist movement and what Mexican people think feminism is, especially outside the cities.
I must say that our country, it's a conservative country, so away from these cities and this urban life, it's not well seen.
When Andrea says that Mexico is a very conservative country, she means that the vast majority of its population is Catholic. Mexico is, in fact, currently the second most Catholic country in the world, which means that feminism is often associated with abortion rights. And despite the fact that abortion in Mexico was decriminalized at the federal level in 2021, that was still not very long ago. And many are still deeply uncomfortable with the subject of sexual and reproductive rights.
They believe that feminism is about that you are going to kill the babies because it's the abortion movement. It's about revenge against men, and that it's time of women. That means we are now going to do to men all the bad things they did to us. And that makes the public really miscomprehend what feminism is about.
Hace unos 2 años, cuando empezó el movimiento feminista, muchas mujeres.
Mexico's current president is Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known as AMLO. And he's not on the best terms with Mexico's feminist movement. In fact, he's been openly hostile.
Our president is saying that the feminist movement right now, it appeared like from thin air, and it only appeared to criticize him and his government.
In 2021, AMLO made the bizarre claim that the feminist movement was only created a couple of years ago, and expressly to oppose his administration.
Convertido en feministas conservadores.
He called it conservative, the damning term that he, as a political leftist, pulls out for his biggest critics. And yet, alongside all of this ire against feminism, Andrea has noticed an increasing trend among Mexican politicians to declare themselves feminist.
Really, like you're feminist. As purple fashion, every woman in politics and everything, they say they are feminist in appearance, yes. In Spanish, it's a saying that de dientes para afuera. Not really from their hearts, they are not feminist, and they are just saying it because it's a fashion.
Do you have any hope that feminist policies will have more of a chance to succeed in the next administration?
I'm doubtful. In first time in our history, there are 3 candidates to the presidency, and 2 of them are women, but I don't think either of them is feminist.
The leading candidate, by many observers, the one poised to win, is Claudia Sheinbaum.
And she was most recently the mayor of Mexico City, and she is a protege of the current president. And the current president has really spearheaded an agenda that I believe has been very detrimental for women, because he has pushed for very extreme austerity measures, and he has also pushed for militarizing everything from critical infrastructure to even the tourist industry.
Danny says she thinks Mexico is at a critical juncture, that democracy is backsliding.
And Claudia Sheinbaum is very much continuing this agenda and the policies from the current government and the current president.
So it's not a feminist agenda.
The other female candidate, Xochitl Gálvez, also advocates for a strong military presence in Mexico.
Un gobierno que abandona sus policías también abandona sus ciudadanos.
Her political party, PAN, is that of the former president who first declared the war on drugs and led to extreme militarization of the country.
It's hard for me to see either of them as feminist leaders and leaders that inspire me and make me hopeful about a feminist future.
Things are changing in Mexico. Congress is now 50% female, for example. But that doesn't mean Mexico's policies are changing to match.
Like, representation is important. It's important to have more women in male-dominated spaces, but it is necessary, but it is not sufficient. And that won't necessarily change the structures and the policies that are needed to achieve gender justice.
So what will make real change for women in Mexico? For many, it's protest, particularly on March 8th.
8 de Marzo, International Women's Day, is a very big day in Mexico because you just see floods of women.
I love these recent years. Our movement, it's really powerful.
Masses, women just flooding the streets around Mexico. And it's not just Mexico City, it's all over the country.
The morning of the march, several different groups of activists were prepping for the protest. Some making signs, some putting up a stage and a sound system. A group of mothers were gathering to begin painting pictures of their children, missing or murdered. Another group was stringing a long clothesline down the length of Paseo de la Reforma and attaching posters bearing the names of men being accused of violence against women. We had arranged to meet with one of these activists.
Marcela.
She's a small woman with bright blue eyes and an energy that cannot be contained. She was here today because
it's impossible to live in a country where there's no justice. I mean, your life can't be if you are not fighting.
We were meeting at the place known as the Roundabout of the Women Who Fight. And this place has quite a story. Here, on an empty plinth that once supported a historic monument, activists have mounted what they call an anti-monument, right in the middle of this historic street.
The mission of this avenue was to talk about the history of Mexico. But for, 135 years, there was no women in the story of Mexico. In all the avenue, there were only men.
At regular intervals along the avenue are monuments to significant male figures in Mexican history. The only representations of women don't depict any actual individual. They're symbolic female figures with bare breasts. Here at this roundabout was a monument to Christopher Columbus, originally installed back in the late 1800s.
Obviously, indigenous people was against this, and they were trying since 80s to take it out.
In response to that pressure from the indigenous community, Christopher Columbus was removed.
So the woman who now is running for president, who was governing Mexico City, Claudia Sheinbaum, she decided to make here an homage to the indigenous women.
It seemed like the right idea, but as far as activists were concerned, Sheinbaum went about it in all the wrong ways. The artist she chose to design it not only wasn't indigenous,
she chose a man really privileged because he's really close to the wife of the president, Pedro Reyes. And he said in media that he wanted to sculpt indigenous women to create love at first sight. So, of course, it made us furious.
In September of 2021, activists climbed over the barriers that authorities had erected around the empty plinth where the Columbus statue had stood, and they put up their own monument, a purple-painted wooden carving of a female figure, her fist raised. Later, activists replaced it with a more permanent version made of steel, and that's the one that's still standing now. And written all over the barriers circling the anti-monument,
mothers of feminicide, victims of feminicide, disappeared. So her daughter was killed, her daughter was killed. There are women that have been walking years and years trying to find. Over there are the buscadoras, the women who try to find the bodies of their sons or daughters. Journalists, artists, we mention many women who has to be mentioned.
And the response of the authorities to all of this?
Really, really bad. I mean, really angry. And they started to make persecution. And they made really, really nasty things like call mothers, for example, who are waiting for a response. And to say, if you, cuando desconoces, if you betray, then we are going to help you to find your daughter.
There was a common theme to the stories that we heard from the women we spoke to that day. Horrible things were happening to them, to their friends, to their daughters. And the police, the officials that they went to for help, they didn't help.
A mother, her daughter disappeared, and the first thing that I asked them is how she was dressed. Why you let her go to the party? Yeah, it's your fault.
Somos madres de víctimas de feminicidio, sobrevivientes de violencia.
Lidia Florencio knows what it feels like to have the people you go to for help make you feel crazy. She spoke to us standing under her own name, written in white letters on the black painted barrier around the anti-monument. She was wearing a t-shirt bearing the image of a beautiful young woman, her daughter Diana.
Estaba embarazada, tenía muchas ilusiones de tener a su bebé.
My daughter was 24 years old. She was pregnant. She liked to ride on a bicycle. She would wear her hair in braids. And she was really looking forward to the future.
One night in 2017 in the state of Mexico, Diana stepped out. Their home didn't have a great cell signal, and she was talking on her phone, so her mom assumed that she left to find a better connection.
Ella desaparece como a las 2 de la mañana.
My daughter disappears at 2 a.m., and neighbors reported that there was a body in the streets around 5 a.m.
Como a las 5:30 de la mañana.
The family soon confirmed the worst. It was Diana. But Lidia says that from the start, the police bungled everything. First, they misidentified the body as male, not female. Nothing that the police did encouraged the family that they could trust them, that they were actually going to help them get justice.
Le vuelvo a repetir, el municipio de Chimalhuacán es muy...
In the municipality, there's a lot of corruption, and they don't want the real number of feminicides to become known. And from the investigations that we have been doing, the family, we know that there are some things that don't match up.
Hay cosas que no cuadran con lo que ellos nos dicen.
Many women were there with their daughters, some of them just infants in arms. Others a bit older with their hair decorated with purple ribbons and flowers, carrying signs that they made with markers and glitter.
All the mothers deserve to see our daughters return home. This one says, Quiero que mi mamá siempre pueda regresar viva a casa. I want my mother to always be able to return home alive.
Mi familia me ha llamado mentirosa, pero nunca han llamado violadora a mi abuelo por lo que me hizo.
My family has called me a liar, but they have never called my grandfather a rapist for what he did to me.
What seemed like an endless mass of women surged down the streets. All day, women were greeting each other with joy, hugging each other, cheering after those standing up to give testimonials. Young masked women with spray paint cans and cylinders that released purple plumes of smoke climbed up onto the statues lining the avenue. They tied purple or green scarves around the monuments' necks, and they spray painted feminist slogans across their surfaces. And it all culminated in a rally at the Zocalo, Mexico City's massive town square that's lined on one side by the presidential palace. The entire area surging with women. Closer to the presidential palace, rockets were being sent up into the air. You could see the air on the far side of the palace filled at regular intervals with objects being thrown over the barrier.
It makes me feel very helpless that it has to be done every year. But it's also I know that there's so many women fighting for this. So that makes me super happy. It makes me super happy to see all of us here at this moment right now.
Seeing over 100,000 women out together in their country's capital, publicly declaring their pain and their hurt, embracing and cheering each other, carrying their smallest children along to share it all, to see the scale of the violence that Mexican women are facing, it was overwhelming. But so was the support and strength that they were giving to each other. It's why Marcela had this to say when we asked her, "Are you hopeful?"
In the women's, yes, but not in the government. In the movement, absolutely.
Despite the declarations of female feminist presidential candidates, despite the announcements to the international community of a feminist foreign policy, Mexican women just aren't getting the protections that they need from the police, public officials, or their government.
So we realize we have to band together and we have to protect each other. And that's actually one of the slogans in protests. It's, the state doesn't look after us. El Estado no nos cuida. La policía no nos cuida. The police doesn't look after us. Nosotras nos cuidamos. Me cuidan mis amigas. My friends look after me.
Martha Delgado doesn't disagree that the feminist foreign policy isn't doing all that it said it would.
A lot of people in Mexico said, how is possible that feminist foreign policy if we have a lot of feminicides in Mexico? It's true. But feminicide is not going to be over if we do not have a feminist foreign policy. But we have to, of course, listen to that. It is true.
Without the policy, there won't be change.
The feminist foreign policy is not about we are doing things that are installed now in our society. It is because we are pursuing to be better. We want to be better. We want to be equitable. It's not because we are right now equitable in the country and not domestic violence is happening here. It's because we are going to do everything in our hands to achieve that.
For all of its shortcomings and unrealized proclamations, if there is room to hope that Mexico's feminist foreign policy is a real sign of progress, of the country's ability to support and protect the lives of women, then maybe that hope lies here. In female friends supporting friends, in mothers fighting for their daughters, in the women of Mexico themselves. In our next episode, we keep traveling, this time to Poland.
These are the abortion pills that I told you about that I have from our group that are an emergency stuff.
Things That Go Boom is distributed by Inkstick Media and PRX. If you like what we do, you can find more at inkstickmedia.com or on social at inkstickmedia. This episode was produced by Amy Drozdowska and edited by Nikki Galtelin. The music for our show is written by Darian Schulman, and Robin Wise is our engineer. A big thanks to Professor Jesus Rivero Casas Whitney Ulick and Jesse Hardman for their help on this episode, and to Layla Miller for translation and production assistance. And thanks, as always, to the supporters and foundations that make our work possible. The Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Cologne Foundation, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. We'll see you all in 2 weeks.
Just looking at the pink bikes. That's awesome. I love them. They're pink. They're very pink. That basket is great. Very cool.
From PRX.